Hi, I'm Emily.
I'm Lillian.
I'm Pratyush.
I'm Suvan.
And I'm Viba, and we're Team Fungus of BWSI's SGAI course. We developed the game to help study human trust in AI and how this can fluctuate with AI performance. The first task was to come up with a research question, and we came up with how does the perceived accuracy of an AI model affect the player's decisions? As AI is becoming more prevalent, there are quite a few applications of this in the real world, like healthcare and autonomous driving. It's important to be able to understand the gap between actual and perceived accuracy. Implementation-wise, the baseline game we were given is set in a zombie apocalypse. As an ambulance driver, the player decides how to respond to each humanoid, aiming to save injured humans. We worked on enhancing the UI and add AI-driven mechanics to support our research. After much grueling, tiresome development, voila, our new improved game.
So we kept the four in-game actions, which is skip to the next round, squish the humanoid, save the humanoid, and scram to the hospital. We added a more readable clock and the capacity bar, and the goal is to maximize your score. As you'd expect, we added a windshield wipe button, an AI prediction display, and a point system. So in our game, we wanted players to feel like what it's like to make decisions in uncertain situations, just like in real life when you're not totally sure whether to trust an AI. To create that feeling, we built a fog system that hides the identity of each character you see on the road. Every time a humanoid figure approaches, it's covered in a foggy layer that blocks the player from seeing who or what it is exactly. This means players can't just rely on visuals, they have to decide whether to go with the AI's prediction or manually wrap the windshield for a cost to get a clear view. So how fog works is that instead of just guessing or getting a full info of each humanoid every time, players need to make a call based on how much they trust the AI. The CNN, which we'll talk about later, is trained to identify whether a figure is a human or a zombie, and players are told that its past performance may vary. Do you believe what the AI is telling you, or do you double check because you're unsure? And how does your past experience with the AI shape that decision? From a technical point of view, the fog is implemented using a semi-transparent overlay that sits right on top of the character images. If they hit the wipe windshield button, the fog is cleared completely, revealing the actual figure behind it. When a new figure is shown, the fog is reapplied immediately, and it stays there until the player hits the button again. The wipe windshield button takes 30 minutes of in-game time, making it a costly move. This mechanic plays a huge role in how trust gets built or broken, and it sort of gives us a unique way to study how people interact with AI under uncertainty, and it made it very clear for us as to when the player started mistrusting the AI.
We implemented 3 CNNs with different biases for 2 key reasons: to give players AI assistance that gave distinct types of mistakes, and to gain hands-on experience actually working with AI. The 3 biases we implemented were a distribution bias, a positional bias, and a skin tone bias. The distribution bias model was trained on 80% humans with fewer zombies and corpses. The positional model saw humans on the right and zombies on the left. Lastly, the skin tone model was trained with light brown humans and dark green zombies. We chose these contrasting biases to make it easier for players to identify model behaviors. This mechanic supports our research question on how trust in AI agents shape player decision making.
After implementing the previous game features, we figured that the player needs a form of immediate feedback to know whether the AI performed accurately on the previous turn. Otherwise, players can't connect their decisions to trust the AI with their resulting scores. It's a relatively simple point systems, but we made it so that the player is aware of the AI's prediction and can identify the actual humanoid in game. This way, the player can understand the types of mistake each model makes and can adjust their strategy or level of trust of the AI for future turns. As the name of these slides suggests, we did have a few notable moments where we needed to reach out for support from either each other or to a teacher. Initially, we were all really excited about this project and had a lot of different ideas that ranged from UI changes, graphics, and even an inventory system. Although it was difficult to discern if we were on the same page, to sift through ideas, and to formulate a research question, our continued efforts to discuss and ask for help created a more efficient working environment. We also had some difficulties with figuring out the general baseline code as well as the CNN model code specifically. I remember we had issues with Mac users not being able to load the program properly, as well as minor issues with installing the right packages. It was also tricky trying to figure out how to modify specific aspects of the code in order to program our desired changes. For the CNN specifically, I personally struggled a lot with decreasing the validation losses to an ideal level of under 0.5, as well as getting the CNN model to run on our bias dataset. However, these issues were resolved with a consistent inquiring for feedback, as well as having numerous problem-solving team discussions that occasionally included a teacher when everyone was stumped.
We collected both subjective and objective data, player responses via Google Forms after each round, and detailed turn-by-turn logs during gameplay. One concern was that players often forgot the rules despite having a cheat sheet. Many kept trusting the AI after major point losses, forgot to scram to the hospital, or saved healthy humans for no reward at all.
From the data collected from the log, here's what we found. The graph on the top shows the total frequency of the players using the wipe or defog feature for each round. The bottom figure shows the distribution of wipes for each round by the players. We can see that the most wipes were in round 2, where the positional bias model was predicting the images. One thing to note is that the ranges of the number of wipes per round are pretty large. Some players wiped a lot, while others players didn't at all. We used the log again to track the player's actions and the CNN's predictions. We wanted to measure the trust in the CNN, so we measured the compliance rate. This is measured by the number of compliant actions over the total actions taken. These are the intended actions. If you see a zombie, you should squish it. If you see a healthy person, you should skip them. If you see an injured person, you should save them. And if you see a corpse, you should skip or squish them. Either one will work. If the player's actions lined up with the CNN's prediction, it was considered with a compliant action. If it did not line up or the player used the defog action, it was a non-compliant decision. The average compliance rate was a little over 50.
Based on the results in the past few slides, we can notice a few interesting trends. The first one comes from the survey, where players themselves reported what they felt like during gameplay. And as you can see in the two graphs, reported perceived accuracy and player trust in the CNNs have similar trends over the 3 rounds. Perceived accuracy also shows that players tended to believe each model was progressively getting worse, even though there were 3 separate models. These two trends, however, don't completely match with the actual accuracy. In the second trend, which was found during the gameplay logs and recorded the players' actions, we can see that the number of times the players did the optimal action corresponded with the model's actual accuracy, as shown in the red graph, with skin bias the highest, left-right bias the lowest, and distributional bias in the middle. Furthermore, it also corresponds very well inversely with the frequency of wipe, which we found indicated distrust per round, as shown in the yellow graph. When looking at these two trends combined, we found that the objective data from gameplay about compliant actions or players' perception of accuracy strongly reflected the actual accuracy. However, when looking at the subjective data, it had different results. When the players themselves self-reported their perception of accuracy, it no longer reflected the actual accuracy. And it raises the question of what caused this inconsistency between players' understanding of their own decisions and their actual decisions.
We concluded that from these trends that the player learned to accommodate to the CNN's poor performance. Even though the perceived accuracy decreased, the compliance rates didn't change much. One issue is that the results were somewhat contradictory, as the players reported feeling less reliant on the AI, but the compliance rate was over 50. In the future, we would like to research how the players' trust changes when they only have one model over many rounds. One interesting thing to think about is how long it would take for the player to develop a strategy to work with the CNN shortcomings. We would also like to try a more accurate but still biased model. This could allow us to see how and when the player could tell the CNN's bias, and also if the player could tell how biased the model is.
Thank you for listening.
Hello, we're Team Psychic. My name is Advita.
I'm Ishan.
Pursued.
And I'm Reina.
So first, we're going to introduce our research questions. We had 3 research questions we focused on trying to answer. Our first question was, how much do humans versus large language models trust artificial suggestions during gameplay? Our second question was, how do humans versus LLMs prioritize non-enforced goals in ethical decision-making? And our third question was, how does the perceived significance of information affect humans versus LLMs?
So now we're going to go over the game in which we used to answer those research questions.
So this is the base game that we were given. As you can see, it's quite bare bones. There's only the 4 basic options, the capacity, and the remaining time. So the 4 options are skip, squish, save, and scram. Skip basically changes the image without doing anything. squish will kill whatever humanoid is on screen. Save will take that humanoid and put them in your ambulance, which will use one of your capacity slots. And scram will run away, which will reduce your capacity to 0.
And the goal of the game was to save as many humans as possible within 12 in-game hours.
So this is our version of the game. As you can see, it's a lot more, there's a lot more features included. So for one, we added occupations. So there's doctor, hunter, builder, and none. We also added injury levels, which aren't pictured here, but there's 3 injury levels, and the more injured a person is, the more resources it takes to save them. We also added the morale and resource bars, which will be explained later, and suggestions from experts, which are a core part of our research. And then overall, we spruced up the UI just to make it look a lot better. And then these are just examples for the 3 entry levels.
So the morale and resource bar, an integral part to our game. The morale level is basically the morale of you and your team members in the ambulance. The way this is affected is by killing humans lowers it, as well as disagreement with your fellow team members or the experts lowers it, but agreement raises it.
So for our resource level, it functions similarly to the morale level. The resource will decrease more as the injury level of the human increase and only decreases when the user saves a human or squishes it because it damages the vehicle. However, both the morale and resource level are not given a final score weighting, so it is entirely up to the LLM and the human player to determine which one they value more and which one they want to prioritize. So we also added suggestions from 4 experts. Each of the experts would choose one action that best corresponds to what they prioritize, and then the suggestions would be displayed on the screen for the player to read. And along with the suggestions, there'll be a consensus of what the entire group chooses based on the majority of the choices by the experts. So the survivalist is conservative on saving heavily injured humans. The logistician conserves resources and times, while the humanitarian prioritizes saving all humans. And then the soldier is a little more impulsive and will often squish or scram. We created a catalog of these suggestions for every morale, resource, time, capacity, and injury level with Gemini 2, and then we loaded these suggestions into the game for the player to see.
So we had humans and an LLM test our game. For the human testing, we had 8 people play 34 total games, offering them minimal instruction. Then we logged the results. For the LLM testing, we used a model we found online called Lava to play 30 games with the same instructions, and we also logged their results.
The data collection and processing, how did we do that? Well, the game was played by the LLM or a human, and then when the game was finished, a CSV output was produced, as seen on the right. The data was then processed by removing erratic cases where the game was not played as intended or the resource or morale level was above 100. After that, we compile the data into a spreadsheet to then do statistical analysis and tests on.
So these are some of our key findings.
So we measured how often the humans and LLM chose each action, and we found that humans preferred squishing, which takes the least amount of time, choosing to squish approximately 46% of the time. In contrast, the LLM preferred skipping, choosing to skip around 39% of the time. Skipping takes more time but is generally considered a safer option. Humans and the LLM had similar saving and scramming rates, often only scramming when their capacity was at full or near full, and a 2-sample t-test confirmed our results.
We found that on average, human players saved more humans than killed the humans, and while the LLMs had a relatively balanced ratio. We also found that the frequency of humans saved per every human killed was much higher for human players at 3.8% compared to the LLM, which had less than 1%. After conducting a 2-proportion z-test, we found that the z-value was around 12, which is an extremely high z-score, and we had a p-value that was significant.
So, the morale and resource values. The humans ended with significantly higher morale level compared to the LLM, and this was statistically significant, just confirmed by a 2-sample t-test. However, as you can see in the bar graph, the LLM ended with much more significantly higher resources compared to the humans. Both the LLM and the human were also statistically significant in conserving resources over raising morale?
So now onto the occupations. As you can clearly see from the bar graph, humans clearly prefer to save those with no occupations over LLMs who save them only about 1% of the time. But LLMs save those who did have occupations in way more than humans, as you can also see in the bar graph.
We found that human players listened to around 62% of the suggestions, while the LLM only listened to 51% of the suggestions. So this means that humans appeared to be more responsive to the expert suggestions in the ambulance, along with them caving under peer pressure. However, it's important to note that the subject player could have chosen to ignore the suggestions entirely, and they might have only realized the consequences of not listening to the consensus and a lower morale later on in the game. So we verified these results with the 2 proportion t-test, and we got a p-value that was significant below 0.05.
So in summary, humans prefer to squish, and they also prefer to save humans over the LLM. They also prefer to maximize resources, and they saved those who didn't have occupations, and they followed suggestions a lot more than the LLMs. Now, the LLMs preferred to skip, and they saved humans a lot less than human players did. They also heavily prioritized resources compared to morale, and they prioritized those who did have occupations over those with no occupations. They also followed suggestions less frequently than human players. And now our conclusions based on our findings.
So now let's go back to the research questions from before and try to answer them. Our first question was, how much do humans versus LLMs trust artificial suggestions during gameplay? And what we found was that humans trusted the suggestions slightly more than the LLM we used, with humans following the suggestions around 10% more of the time.
To answer our second research question of how humans versus LLMs prioritize non-enforced goals in ethical decision-making, we found that humans appear to prioritize these goals a lot less than LLMs. While humans focused on the humanoids themselves, including classifying their type and injury level, they usually disregarded the time, capacity, morale, or resource level. And on the other hand, LLMs prioritize these non-enforced goals a lot more.
Our third question was, how does the perceived significance of information affect humans versus LLMs? We found that the LLM's gameplay was more greatly affected by the perceived significance of non-consequential information, specifically the human occupations. The LLM tended to save humans with occupations it assumed were more valuable. Human players, on the other hand, generally saved all humans, but specifically saved many people with no occupation.
Now, Beaverworks is a 1-month course, and as a result, we couldn't make a fully fledged serious game in just 1 month. Those take years. However, if we were to continue this game in the future and add on stuff to it, our main steps would be to compare different LLM performances, such as Grok. We would research the behavior of these more advanced AI in the game and how they react with the ethical dilemmas. Another thing we'll do is expand the scope of the game and add in different elements to increase the ethical dilemmas.
We would also like to make the game more engaging, as we found during experimentation that some of the testers were bored near the end of the game, and we feel that this could be done in the form of new mechanics and dilemmas.
Overall, we were able to use an existing framework and design a serious game that compared the ethical decision-making skills of human players and LLMs. And then we were able to analyze our data to understand how humans versus LLMs reacted under peer pressure scenarios, prioritized morale, resources, and occupations, and decided between saving or killing humans.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. We are Team Splice, and we're honored to present our project for SGAI 2025. We have worked together to bring forward a unique blend of creativity and research, and we're excited to walk you through our work and process today.
We'll begin by discussing our research question, followed by key design elements like our UI, RL, and CNN. Then we'll present an analysis of the data we collected from the users in RL, and finally, we'll share our conclusions and our next.
All right, let's start with the research question and the background of our project. We knew that we wanted to integrate an RL learning algorithm into our project somewhere, so we posed this research question. How would an RL algorithm trained by us differ from a human when attempting to optimize score in a game that is functionally about morality? Based on this main question, we thought about exploring three subtopics. The first being how the decisions would change, the second being potential factors that could bias these decisions, and the last being whether we thought that AI was moral in this context. Our prerequisite course had many things that we learned off of, including applications of AI in real life. Additionally, we also got roughly a week of learning about AI and their different systems through the beginning of the program. As such, our team hypothesized that humans will be more likely to save humans than the RL when given the task to optimize the score of a morally driven game.
In the SGAI prerequisite course, we were assigned to review the MIT moral machine. The MIT moral machine poses a hypothetical scenario in which the player must choose the lesser of two evils. So, in order to answer our research question of human versus artificial intelligence in moral decisions, we chose to design our game by taking these elements inspired by the moral machine.
To begin with, we were provided with a baseline game that was simple and quite basic. The core mechanic was decision making in response to encounters with either zombies or humans. At each scenario, the players have four options: skip the interaction, squish, or kill, save the individual by adding them to the ambulance, or scram, which meant returning to base and empty the ambulance. The game ran on a timer, ending when the day concluded. This basic structure laid the foundation for the enhancement we later introduced.
Now onto our game design. This is the game's intro screen where players can start the game or view instructions. The instructions clearly outline the objective, so users know what to focus on when playing the game.
This is the main interface of our game. On the left, there's the action menu where you can choose what to do, like scram, inspect, squish, save, or skip. At the top, you'll see the upgrade shop, rules, and exit buttons. In the center, you have two characters and a suggestion from the CNN model, which might not always be right. Below that is the inspection information, which is always accurate but takes time to use. On the right, you can see the current time, how full the ambulance is, how far along you are on the route.
Now that we have had a general rundown of the UI, let's have a short product demonstration. You can see here that the player is making decisions like clicking the left-hand action menu buttons. This triggers changes in the images, time, ambulance capacity meter, and route position. Now the player is upgrading their ambulance after earning money from safely delivering humans back to base. And finally, the player then completes the route and can see their end of game statistics.
Different to our baseline game, our version displays images on both the left and right-hand side of the screen. Using Unity enabled us to generate a diverse range of character visuals and buildings using the Unity Asset Store. An implemented C# script helped add environmental effects such as rain, which made the characters slightly blurry, increasing difficulty for the user.
In order to answer our research question of how a human versus an RL agent operates, it's necessary that we add in some dilemmas. As seen before, a player's decision can apply to one of two sides, where each side may have more than one humanoid, like in the moral machine. We then compounded the time limitation with an ambulance route that must be completed by the end of the day, limiting a player's actions. And lastly, we diversified the humanoids by adding occupations that can affect the rates of zombie infections or cures in the case that they have been added to your ambulance.
We also added an upgrade system to make the game more fun and rewarding. Now, when you scram and bring save human back to base, you earn money. Every human that you save gives you $10, and then you can use this money to buy upgrades. There are three things you can improve: how many people the ambulance can carry, how fast you can scram back to base, and how much time it takes to inspect someone.
Okay, so here's a AI overview of what we did in our project. This will include the CNN the players received and the reinforcement learning agent that we use to compare against human decisions. So we trained our CNN to identify status and occupation of the humanoid. We purposely made the CNN give inaccurate decisions at times to sort of force players to make decisions with a little uncertainty. This creates a trade-off where you could trust a possibly wrong AI suggestion and risk squishing innocent people, or spend time to inspect and get the right information, but risk the chance to save more people in the future. You also used a reinforcement learning system to ultimately compare decisions chosen between the RL agent and the human players. Reinforcement learning was the best AI model to use in this case, as there's too much variables and complexity to label all certain cases in our game. Also, because our game follows a score-based system, we can easily reward and punish the RL agent to help it optimize a good strategy for maximum scoring. To allow a fair comparison between the RL agent and human decisions, we created a very similar environment but simplified, as having too much variables and actions for the RL can lead it to struggle with convergence and could potentially make the learning process exponentially longer. One example of how we simplified the environment was by not including shop upgrades, which was unnecessary for deciding between the two scenarios. By simplifying the environment while keeping the core moral dilemmas intact, we ensure that the RL can actually learn meaningful decision patterns that we can compare against human decisions.
Now let's take a look at the data we collected and our analysis of it. We collected data over 45 human test runs and 30 RL runs. We tasked both human participants and our RL to maximize their score, which they could raise by saving humans or killing zombies. Our first chart here simply analyzes the general actions each tester took. As we can see, the large green chunk in the human graph represents that humans often saved other people, while the large red chunk in the RL graph represents that the RL often squished people. Overall, the humans and RL preferred to save and squish, while they both did not like to skip or scram. Interestingly, the RL only skipped twice out of roughly 600 actions taken. Now we try to analyze how potential biases could affect these actions. This graph here demonstrates the different human actions and how it changes based on the ambulance capacity. The size of the column represents how many actions are taken at each capacity, and each subsection for the column represents the number of actions for that specific type in that action space. Here, we can see that both the human and the RL had similar save patterns, being lower for when the ambulance was empty, and spiking a bit and coming back down. Interestingly, this pattern is also noticeable for the squish action, both on this visual chart and percentage-based. This slide introduces how the route position affected people's actions. The game ends when you reach position 20. Similar to the previous graph, the size of the column represents how many actions were taken at that route position, and then each subsection corresponds to the type of action. Since we go on the same length of route most of the time, the columns are generally the same size. We can see that for the humans, the squish rate was pretty consistent, and for the RL, the save rate was pretty consistent. This is our last bias graph, which goes over the different roles and how they affected people that picking them up. We added up all the people saved through the runs and analyzed what roles they were. What's interesting here is that even though the RL did not save as many people, it actually saved more people that had no role bonus. Roughly 70% of the people picked up were civilians or children who don't get any bonus from their roles, compared to only 60% from the human testers. Overall, the most picked up were the civilians, then children, then doctors, police, and militants, holding true for both the human and RL testers.
We also observed some qualitative results, mainly as a result of human feedback and other interesting lessons that we learned as we conducted playtesting. For one, we found that both humans and the RL agent found squishing to be more favorable than skipping, likely because squishing has a lower time cost than skipping. Based on feedback, we also found that the time management dilemma or the route length could have been more intense, which would have led to more interesting data points. Overall, we noted that during playtesting, human players had a tendency to prioritize humanoids. This does raise another interesting point of analysis of how the game progression could affect players' choices on different occupations of people. So, with our game development and data analysis experience, here are our main takeaways. We learned that humans and our RL agent have varying strategies and values. While RL perceives the game with a more polarized mindset, either squishing or saving, humans consider more weightings such as occupations, skipping scenarios, and scrimming. With that, RL's strategy of score optimization has less regard for human life, where they prefer to kill zombies over saving humans. Humans too optimize their score, but they do so with more complex methodology, employing actions beyond squishing and saving. And by doing so, they can also abide by personal morals that ensure that human life is preserved as much as possible. So that is all we have. Thank you so much for listening.
Thanks so much.
Hi everyone, we are Team Turing Test. We are serious game development with AI from the BWSI course. In this project, we were tasked to develop a serious game to answer a research question. So what was our research question? Our research question was, how do AI models with different ethical systems differ in their behavior over time from that of a human when trained independently in the same game environment?
Why does this matter? One, the importance of AI. Over the past years, AI has been increasingly more integrated in every facet of our lives. Two, morals. Our project allows us to explore whether AI, despite being trained to act optimally, can display complex moral behaviors like humans. And three, future applications. We can better design ethical AI agents that can make split-second decisions and also design ethic tests for these AI agents.
Let's go over our experimental plan. We first built two reinforcement learning models, each trained to have different moral codes. Human players and the models will act as ambulance drivers in a 3D post-apocalyptic serious game in order to collect data. A serious game is a game not meant for entertainment, but for other things like training, education, and in our case, research. So the game will pose difficult dilemmas that create ethical questions, and then we compared the model and human decisions in the game. From there, we investigated how complex reward functions shape ethical behavior in AI. Moving on to the 3D game, we built the 3D game using Unity, and it had both a player and an agent mode. The player mode is what allowed actual people to play the game, and it's how we got human data. And the agent mode used a NavMesh agent, which is a Unity package to navigate the world, and it queried the RL model in order to make a decision. This is just a quick demo of the game. This is a player mode. You can see I'm moving towards a model and I can make a decision based on that. And now when I toggle to the agent mode, it will navigate by itself there and make a decision. The info won't show up, but you can see that it's happening based on the time remaining going down.
This is a game rule sheet that we showed our human participants when they were playing our serious game. Each game consists of 3 in-game days, which each have 720 minutes, for players to go around the game world, acting as the ambulance driver and interacting with entities. There are 4 decisions players can make: save, scram, squish, and skip, as shown on the right-hand side. And aside from being humans and zombies, each entity has 4 other attributes that contribute to the player's decision on those entities. Those attributes are age, death chance, injury severity, and occupation. And the combination of those attributes and their impact on the game and the base back home create these dilemmas that players have to contend with. The overall goal of the game is to maintain the resource count and the people count at the base above 0. And if either of those numbers go to 0, you automatically lose. So it's important for players to balance those different factors and attributes when they're making decisions in order to do so.
So now onto the RL. An RL is a model that is trained on a reward function. Positive meaning good, keep doing it, and negative meaning no, don't do it. And in order for an RL to be effective, it has to maximize its rewards. The first RL model we developed was a utilitarian model, which we believe would define the best morals of a utilitarianism. We designed the reward function intending for the model to perform the optimal action to produce the greatest benefit for the greatest number of people, even if the action performed was morally dubious.
To create the ethical model, we had to first define ethical by sending a poll to our class asking for their thoughts on what an ethical ambulance driver would prioritize when choosing what to do with someone. We use those results to design the rewards by taking the average of the median and mean of the poll response values to weigh the different factors in the reward functions.
Yeah, and we had 5 different rewards. R1 is productivity, 2 is resources, 3 is saving humans, 4 is squishing zombies, and 5 is time cost. For a utilitarian model, we only use the first 3 with emphasis on R1 and R2. And for our ethical model, we used all 5 with emphasis on R3, saving humans. So specifically, we used an algorithm called PPO, or proximal policy optimization. PPO is a policy gradient method, which means it directly trains the agent's policy. It also uses a clipped objective that prevents wild swings in decision making.
In order to account for our complex models, we had to use a three-stage approach. The first stage was just to learn to differentiate between zombies and humans. Stage 2 was a more complex and more explorative environment, which allowed for new behaviors and new things. Stage 3 was to refine and exploit what it had learned in the past and to reinforce the stage 1 and stage 2.
Here is how we collected our data. Each human subject was placed into our game environment where they played for 3 continuous in-game days, while the reinforcement learning agents were tested through a Python script which simulated the game. For each entity encountered, the action in response to it was recorded in a CSV file, along with a CSV file after each day detailing the summary of that day and the updated status of the base.
Yeah, and here are our results and our analysis. So humans prioritize resources more than people compared to the pull-based and utilitarian model. But surprisingly, the models perform very similarly in the game despite having different reward functions.
Looking more closely at some stats from the actual gameplay, you can see that humans continue to outperform both the RL models on most fronts by quite significant margins. The more interesting result here, however, is seen when you look at the 2 columns for the RL models only. Again, instead of seeing a clear win for the utilitarian model, which we were actually expecting because the reward function is all about optimization, it actually had mixed results, where it was losing to the pull-based for some of the stats and winning to the pull-based on other stats. This indicates that the decision-making processes for the 2 reinforcement learning models were actually quite similar, despite the fact that the reward functions were very different.
These are the graphs for the actions that humans took when encountering human entities in the game. The left 2 charts feature the percentage of each action taken based on attributes, while the pie chart on the right displays the distribution of actions taken on all humans. Human players largely base their decisions on the death chance and occupation of human entities. As the death chance increases, generally, the rate of squishing increases and the rate of saving decreases. Humans also treated violent criminals more harshly, choosing to squish when encountering them almost 60% of the time, and almost never saving them. Both of the models, as well as the humans, skipped zombies almost every single time. However, human players were unique in how they handled human entities in the game, displaying action patterns in response to encounters with them that are drastically different from that of the reinforcement learning models.
In contrast, the pull-based RL model chose to save a lot more people and skip a lot less. So it seems like in the poll, the humans were a lot more forgiving when filling that out, but in the actual game were less forgiving. For the utilitarian RL model, this was actually very surprising for us because we expected it to make more morally dubious choices, but instead it determined that saving the most amount of humans and saving all the humans and squishing all the zombies created the greatest good for the greatest amount of people.
We accomplished a creation of data collection with frameworks for ethical dilemmas by creating a 3D simulation of an apocalyptic scenario where the players make decisions. We also created a way to record AI performance through a Python script mimicking the actual game. We got data of each of the actions and logged its outcomes, leading us to see that human decision in-game led to the best in-game decisions. But humans on average were more violent.
Now, a really interesting result that we got was the unexpected performance of the utilitarian reinforcement learning model. Because our reward function was designed specifically so that it would optimize for the in-game rewards and not necessarily keep in mind whether saving all humans is good or killing humans is bad, we were expecting for the utilitarian model to be a lot more picky and choosy. But it turns out that, as we saw, the utilitarian model always saved people, implying that the greatest good for the greatest amount of people under that reward function actually just came from saving all the people. This was a really interesting result that we got as a result of the framework that we designed and the data that we collected. Thank you so much for listening.
Good afternoon, BWSI. My name is Jimmy.
My name is Ion.
My name is Cedral.
My name is CM.
My name is Sahari.
And today, we're here to present our serious game, ADMES, Ethical Decision Making in Emergency Scenarios, which investigated time pressure, social consequences, and moral dilemmas in a game-like environment.
Our team wanted to test the effect of social consequences and time pressure on the decision-making in subjects. We'll talk more about how we did this in later slides.
With escalating time constraints, players would exhibit a tendency to prioritize a single score, thereby disregarding the potential repercussions on the other meters.
As a foundation for our experiment, we were provided with the baseline game featuring the following interface. As demonstrated, the game exhibits limited functionality and a rudimentary user interface, which was both aesthetically disorganized and impractical. In an initial effort to make the game more playable, we made some basic interface improvements, including a more readable timer and a uniform color scheme. The timer plays an important role in the game given that each round is randomly timed on an interval between 30 and 90 seconds, and the player plays 3 rounds in each game. This allowed us to indirectly measure how a player's decisions change with varying time pressure. Most subjects played 3 to 4 games on average. To make the game more immersive, we also included a realistic ambience dashboard, a humanoid role label, and real-life sound effects. Can you give us a demonstration, Tao? We also added a dynamic scoring meter to make our game more immersive in an effort to make the players feel more moral weight for their actions.
Going off of what Ayan just said about dynamic meters, our meters measured reputation. We created 4 third-party observer groups: military, human rights activist, or HRA, medic, and scientist. And they looked at the player-specific actions, which impacted the group's individual meters. On the picture on the left, you can see how the reputation meters may change after one round, moving away from its default value set at 500 for every game. Each observer group valued player actions differently. For example, the HRA focused on the humanitarian rescue of all survivors, whereas the scientists wanted to study zombies to find a cure. We won't get too in-depth about all the complex ways these 4 groups respond to each player action, but it's important to note that all 4 reputation metrics are evaluated in different magnitudes and directions based on specific player interactions.
Okay, so these are the roles that we have in our game. We have just the default. We have the business, we have medics, we have elderly people, and then we have the police. And we got this data from Team Prime, which made their game in 2023. These are our states. All of our states are distributed equally. So we have the healthy, normal people, and we have zombies, and we have injured people, but they're not actually dead yet. And then there's corpse, which are just dead bodies.
The ways the points in these 4 meters are calculated are based on 3 factors. First is the action the player commits, so squish, scram, skip, or save. But more specific calculations are based on the states presented on this slide: healthy, injured, zombie, and corpse. Each slide has a slightly different point value for each reputation meter. And furthermore, the healthy and injured human also have role modifications, where the role of the healthy human or injured human can also affect the point interactions. The previous slide was a little abstract, so here we will see some example calculations.
On the left, we have a player squishing a doctor zombie. The role the zombie has no effect on the point interactions, as the zombie is treated the same regardless of role. However, squishing a zombie has the following effects on the reputation meter that we can take into account on the image below. You can see that the points differ drastically, ranging from +40 for the doctor meter to -40 for the human rights activist meter. On the right side, we have a slightly more complex interaction, saving an injured policeman. First, we applied the injured baseline, which we can see in the first line of the table. But then we add in the role modification. So in our final case, this police has a final point adjustment that is presented in the third row of the table.
In our round over screen, there are four main elements, which are the summary, the meters, the stats, and the image. So first, our summary, which is generated by a Grok API, where we tell the API the actions the player took and their stats, which are on the top left side, during the round, and the API makes a catchy, dramatic news-style headline and blurb about the player's actions during that round. Then meters, which show the changes from the beginning of the round to the end of the round. Then our stats, which are the basic quantitative summary of the player's actions that are later used to calculate margins in the game over screen. And lastly, an image, where a humanoid that the player encountered with a caption describing their action towards it. Our goal with this screen was to prompt deeper reflection by confronting the player with the consequences of their in-game decisions. By presenting this summary between rounds, we aim to encourage players to reassess their strategies and adapt their approach in the upcoming round. This moment of feedback serves not only as a checkpoint, but also as a subtle behavioral nudge, inviting players to consider the broader impact of their choices. Evidence of these adaptive shifts in decision-making can be observed in the patterns in our data analysis. So next is our end game screen, our mission report screen, which shares several design elements with the round over screen, such as summaries, performance stats, and reputation meters, though with subtle distinctions. While the round over screen offers immediate feedback after each phase, the mission report provides a more holistic view of the entire playthrough. It acts as a final moment of reflection, encouraging players to consider the broader consequences of their decisions. Although the performance assessment is not used in our quantitative or qualitative data analysis, it serves as a player-facing evaluation tool. The ratings, poor, mediocre, good, and excellent, are determined by the formulas that measure the margin between humans saved and zombies killed, giving players an intuitive sense of how well they performed overall. The meters measure the change in the reputation statuses from the beginning of the game, where all meters are set to 500.
Here's a graph that shows the average decision time versus the round duration. We predicted that as the round duration decreases, so would decision time. From the data, we observe a very weak correlation that does show a general trend that supports that. Essentially, we noticed that to our extent that the time variation did not add that much pressure, and this lines up with qualitative trends that we saw in post-game survey.
To quantitatively evaluate meter distribution, we calculated coefficients of variation for each final meter value, using the standard deviation of each distribution divided by the mean of each distribution, where higher coefficients represent a focus on one or two metrics, while lower coefficients represent a focus on maximizing most or all of the meters. On the y-axis of this graph is our variation coefficient as a percentage, and on the x-axis is the game duration for a given player, since this metric comprises of the total time a player was given across all rounds. In our hypothesis, we predicted that providing the player with less time would result in more specialization. However, as you can see in the data, less time does not necessarily correlate with an increase in specialization, but rather the opposite, where more time weakly correlates with more specialization.
Another observation we made was a trend with the number of times the player hit skip. As you can see, round 1 in each game has a small amount of skips, followed by a steep increase of skips in round 2, with a slight decline in round 3. And we presume this trend was a result of a learning effect, specifically the player's understanding of the round over screen and them changing their methods. However, we do not see the same pattern in the use of save or squish.
Learning effects could have also affected changes beyond just the actions, but the meter values itself. Here we have three graphs displaying average meter change per round for games 2 through 4. On the x-axis is the round number, and on the y-axis is the average point change each of the 4 meters encountered per action in that round. In game 2, we can see that all 4 meters behaved relatively similarly, with all the actions occurring within 0 and 5 points per action. However, in game 3 and 4, the meters started to diverge. In game 4, there's a clear separation between two groups, the first group being the medic and military meters, which trended up each consecutive round, while the scientist and human rights activist bars went down initially and then bounced up. This suggests that as players got more experienced after playing more games, they began prioritizing the military and medic meters, possibly due to those meters' emphasis on saving lives and squishing zombies. Additionally, some players noted that they valued HRA less than the other meters over time, which could explain why HRA leans more on the negative side in games 3 and 4.
To end off, recall that the study was on the effect of time pressure and social consequences on decision making. Time pressure, to the extent that we varied it, showed very little effect on decision making. In terms of how it affected specialization, that is focusing on increasing 1 meter, there was also a lack of evidence to suggest this. However, we did observe that there was some correlation between player experience and specialization, which could be a topic of further study and future experimentation.
Thank you.
Hi, we are Team Regenerate. I'm Natalie.
I'm Andrew.
I'm Ariel.
And my name is Rachel. In a post-zombie apocalypse world, can you save humanity with just 6 characters? This is the question that we wanted to explore in our video game, Zombie Punk. More specifically, our research question was how people adapt their communication strategies when they are only given limited communication in a high-stress situation. Enter our video game, Zombie Punk. To research this question, we developed Zombie Punk as an asymmetric multiplayer video game. In this game, there's 2 roles. Player 1 is the driver who drives around the post-apocalyptic world in an ambulance to save people and bring them back to the colony. The second player is the colony manager, whose job is to upgrade and regulate the colony back home. However, neither player initially knows the other's full occupation capabilities or objective and is only given a limited number of characters to communicate in the text chat. And certain common characters are also banned to make communication even more difficult. We actually developed and collected data from 2 different versions of ZombiePunk. The first was built in Unity. In this game, the main objective was for the manager to develop the vaccine to cure the zombie plague. The second game was a text-based game developed in Python. We originally developed it as a backup in case we didn't finish Unity development in time, but soon realized that it could be an effective way to collect more communication data. And in this version, the driver's main objective is to collect the randomly generated number of humans of a specified occupation.
Now, into the more specific Unity game mechanics. For the driver side, it is pretty similar to the base game. Driver will go into the street and meet some person. They could either choose to save it or to ignore it to save some few. And the person could have 4 occupations. And the driver initially doesn't know the occupation of the people it meet. And when the manager bought driver upgrade, a sensor upgrade, the driver will know beforehand and will be able to choose. On the manager side, on the other hand, it's more like a simulation game. The manager side, manager food, if you place farmer in there, will produce food. And food is the basic currency for all of the game. You can do a lot of things with it. You can either use it to build and upgrade buildings, which there's 4 buildings that develop the colony progress. You can build it to upgrade the driver's ambulance, or you can upgrade the child limit to increase the amount of character player can type when communicating. And the point for manager is the manager have to decide how to allocate the resources to achieve the vaccine in last round as possible. After each round, both player will enter into the chat room, and you can see in the AI right here, one player will type into the message Well, for both players, they'll type their own message into the chat log, and you'll see the message of the other side inside the UI. And both players initially can only type a max 6 characters into the chat. And for among those 6 characters, the character F, B, or D are banned. So for example, when the manager wants to type farmer, the manager couldn't type F and R, so the manager have to type A, M, E. So it's pretty hard for the other side to understand, and that simulated a high-stress communication environment. The point is that for the both players, they have to figure out some way to collaborate and communicate inside this high-stress communication environment in order to reach the game with as less round as possible.
So we observe a number of varying strategies of communication throughout our playtesters of our Unity game. And so we broke them into 4 different categories. So the first strategy we saw was typing everything as normal and as if the banned characters didn't exist and just hoping that the other person understood what you were saying. So here we have an example. The manager said I UI sensor, which stood for I buy sensor. And then the driver responded with UEL for fuel. And then strategy number 2 would be substituting banned words with synonyms. So for example, one player substituted fuel or gas for fuel while asking for the manager to upgrade their fuel capacity. And then another manager, instead of saying that they wanted farmers, they said that they wanted cow chicken to convey that they wanted farmers. And another strategy is using homophones. So this was mostly seen with the letter F. Players would tend to use PH to make that same sound, but they would also sacrifice their character limit. So it was not used as often. So here you can see a driver substituted F for PH and fuel, and another manager did PH for farmer. And lastly, another strategy was using abbreviations. So this was also just to ensure that messages were as concise as possible because of the character limit. So over here, you can see that one driver, when asking to upgrade capacity, they just asked for plus cap. And then another driver, instead of asking for occupations, they asked for jobs and then shortened that down to J. So then here they asked for J and then plus how many for using the pound symbol. And then over here, we can see these are all the messages that were sent throughout our playtest. And so we just compiled them all and then have the meaning and intent as well. So I'll just go over some of the most interesting ones here. As you can see, this manager, when asking for researchers, instead of using R, they use W to kind of make that same sound again and make it a little bit easier for someone to understand. This manager was asking for doctors, so they wrote out help PE so that it could be translated as help people, which could then be interpreted as doctors. Here, the same manager also was asking for the same number of farmers. And then this one was also very interesting. This person, instead of saying occupation, was asking for jobs and then how many that the manager needed. And what was really interesting was that during this playtest, the driver and the manager had a very efficient mode of communication. And after a while, like a couple of rounds of the driver saying the same thing, the manager did not even need the driver to send out the message and they would understand what they needed immediately.
And here's our Python game, and it's similar to the Unity. The manager had these character banned, and the driver had no restrictions. In between turns, the manager would communicate which occupations they want, and the driver can ask follow-up questions. We ran 3 rounds of this. In rounds 1 and 2, the players switched roles, and in round 3, we ran it with new players. And so here are some things that we found. First, players used visual replacements, such as representing D as CL, or as in figure A, representing biologists with numbers. Second was the emergence of etiquette. In figure B, the driver apologized for not picking up any farmers, but this was different for the manager who had more pressure to communicate information. And in one case, the manager wanted to type please, but this was later deleted, and in this case, etiquette was sacrificed for directness and clarity. And next, when the players switched roles in round 2, the manager referred back to the term NUSE that the previous manager used in round 1 to represent nurse. And here they created their own vocabulary and code words and could understand each other. And also, words depend on context. So in figure E, the word e-seek only makes sense in context and in relationship to the previous question where the other person asked research or health. And next, when the players were stuck, I tell them to get creative, and they came up with all these different communication strategies. And I wasn't really telling them how to be creative or what to do, but somehow saying get creative made them more creative. And finally, we all carry our own mental dictionaries. So in figure F, we see that the manager articulated farmers as peasants, and in figure G, when the roles were switched, the player now as the driver still kept their mental model of farmers as peasants. But the other player didn't share this definition, so they didn't know what peasants meant. And this contrasts with figure H, where farmer was described using behavioral attributes such as plant guy or cultivate, and the two players could understand each other.
Now into more specific data analysis. Even beside the specific character two-player time in the chat, we still see some interesting dynamic from how two-player collaborate in the game trend overall. Right here is two graph. On the top graph is the distribution of the occupation of the worker the driver brought back to farmer. So for each round, we can see that there's it indicate how many worker driver brought back, and also what are the occupations the manager requested from last round. And on the bottom chart, it is the ambulance upgrade given by the manager to the driver, and also what has the driver requested from the last round. Here is the same data from another game, but here we can see from obviously there's so much less data. The driver in this game requested far less amount of upgrade from the manager, and the manager in turn give less upgrade. The driver, because there's less upgrade, can also give far less amount of hospital worker, or no, not hospital, but just worker to the manager, and manager just work with that. But this game actually progressed faster and better to the last game. This game finished in 12 round versus the last game in 14 round. A general conclusion we can draw from this Unity data is that two players often follow their own strategy to support collaboration. They don't always strictly follow their request. For example, when the manager requested to have a researcher collected as a worker, the driver wouldn't always just collect researcher. When the driver see worker of other occupation, the driver would still think that, oh, they could still be useful for the manager side, so they will collect them back too. And often it is actually more useful for the driver to act that way. In the manager too, the manager also, for example, when driver asks for ambulance upgrade, but the manager doesn't have enough resources to support both the upgrade and the colony upgrade, the manager also prioritize the colony's need over the driver's need and satisfy their own need first, and then look into driver's request. And the game usually perform better when both sides act this way and have less requests. If both player request put more requests on each other, they will often mess up the priority of the request. For example, when the driver requests some ambulance upgrade, the manager know the upgrade driver requested, but the manager doesn't know the priority of that upgrade. So the manager would often prioritize the driver's upgrade upper or below its colony upgrade and mess up the manager's plan. So once both players only communicate their most emergent need to other player, the game would usually perform better with both players able to manage in their own side better.
So what are some overall conclusions that we can make from this? We created two games that both collected quantifiable data on limited human communication in high-stress situations. And in these two games, players formulated varying types of strategies to overcome the communication barriers. And additionally, these strategies were generally consistent in both games. So for example, in both games, players would substitute banned words or characters with characters that they could actually use. And most of them had their own code words that made sense within their own linguistic ecosystems.
Thank you for listening. And we would also like to give a special thank you to Rob and all of our TAs.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
What's up, guys? Welcome back to another banging SGI research project. We're Team Zomboid. I'm Enzo. Anson, say hi.
Hi.
Nia.
Hello.
And you.
Hi, guys.
We want to tackle the fundamental research question of what are the optimal strategies for a player to manage public opinion and safety to ensure the long-term success or stability of a camp. We had two main metrics to analyze this, which were morale and camp population, both of which the player wanted to keep as high as possible in our experiment. So why does this question even matter, right? This question has some implications on people delegating either other people or machines in the coming future, where we don't know how to trust them or we don't know exactly what their skills are.
Okay, so how exactly does this game work? You first play as a camp manager managing a survivor camp over 20 days. We expanded the complexity of the game by allowing for the players to interact with four different unique scenes and kept the pressure up by having each day last a limited amount of time. Okay, our first scene is an ambulance minigame where you're given various images of humanoids, including zombies, healthy injured humans, and corpses. In this scene, you can increase your population, which fulfills one of the main objectives of the game. You'll have to classify an image and decide whether or not you like to save whoever's in it into your ambulance and back into your camp. After saving your humans, you'll see them appear as part of your camp's roster in the home base scene. You can assign one camp member to work in each of the three available jobs in the camp. Each job gives crucial benefits at the end of each day, granting important stats and resources. Each human in your camp is given a name, status, profession, and competency level, which all can give a good indication on which camp member would best fill each job. Keeping a lot of camp members requires obviously a lot of food, so our foraging ensures that the player can gather enough food to fulfill our camp's needs. There are healthy and unhealthy plants on each different set of crops in which you'll spend time deciding on which crop is worth taking. It's important to gather enough food in this scene so that your camp don't starve by the end of each day. Supplies are also very important as they drive your workers in your camp to do their jobs. You are also given an image of a story containing red objects that represent supplies. Clear out all the zombies and bring back the supplies to your camp.
As for how we collected our data, we had 4 virtual playtesters come in. Since we weren't sure about their ability to download the game on their own, we had the game shared on our screen and played it for them, but following their decisions. We had the gameplay data logged onto a file on our computer so that later we could stop and analyze it. The data we collected involved the buttons clicked, population, the supplies, people saved versus people killed, etc. But there were a couple of drawbacks that we might want to fix if we did it again. For example, the timing could have been a little bit off, and players couldn't always properly see the screen since, again, it was a screen share and misclicks did unfortunately happen.
Okay, so what do we find when the players play the game? First of all, we have population, and you can see in this first run on the top that population had a lot of peaks and valleys where players got too many people in their camp, and as a result, they had a lot of die-offs where the people in their camp literally starved to death at the end of the day because they didn't have enough food. But on run two, this was a lot better, right? You can see population in general is a lot lower, but it's also a lot flatter of a line. There's not so many peaks and valleys because they had a stable population that they could actually support. And you can see it's better on run three as well, even though we only have 2 data points for that. And then food, this is tied in with the population where you have these peaks and valleys where you can see the food goes down. And then if you look back at the population graph, you'd see the population went down as well because of that. So on run one, you have these people all bottoming out. Pretty much everyone universally bottom out at some point on the food. But on run two, you can see a lot less people are completely bottom of the barrel on food. Food's a lot higher in general, a lot more stable. So they kept a more stable population. And for supplies, it's kind of a mess on run one, right? You see people just like the food and population are bottoming out a lot, and it's very hectic. But on run two, almost nobody bottom out on supplies. Everybody almost universally realized that they needed supplies to run their NPCs so they could get the help as far as supply running and foraging goes to support their camp. So on average, right, if we look down at food and supplies, we can see even discarding the third round, food was a lot higher on run two than it was on run one. And you can see the same for supplies, where run two was also a lot higher than run one. But population, you can see it was the same for almost all the runs, right? Even run 3, it was same for the most of it and only grew at the end. So part of this is because we found out from our qualitative results. When we interviewed our players, run 1 was definitely just learning the game. Players didn't know how to play yet, so they just were figuring out their strategy. But run 2 was a lot more directed, where players now understood the game, and they also could make faster decisions now and have a real strategy. So, which meant that players started, instead of having NPCs on all the rolls, they took their NPC off the ambulance because they didn't want population to grow too fast. And so our research question kind of changed over time. We kind of learned to look at how players delegated their workload when they don't know if they can trust who they're working with, right? So originally we wanted to frame this as NPCs lying to the players, but that didn't actually work. But players still didn't trust their NPCs. Instead of being scared their NPCs might lie to them, they were just scared their NPCs weren't smart enough to make smart enough decisions for a high stake role. So in game, this meant that players didn't put NPCs, like I said, on the ambulance roll because they didn't trust the NPC to bring in the right people, and they trusted that the NPC would probably bring in too many people. So they wanted to control the flow of people into the camp themselves manually. So this means because they manually control population, we definitely saw that in game it was very important to not bite off more than you could chew, right? Too many people would mean that you didn't have the food supplies to support them. So you'd have these die-offs, which was a big problem for players on the first run. More concretely, and also kind of outside the game, because players hesitated to put NPCs on the ambulance role because they perceived that these NPCs weren't competent enough for that job, we saw a necessity that when we want a person, we want consumers to use something, or we want like a boss to promote an employee, right? Or you want your boss to promote you. There is both the need for an actual capability and a perceived capability where people have to think something or someone is good enough for that high stakes role.
So we looked at how this is important in game, but how is it important out of the game? So in the real world, as we increasingly rely on artificial intelligence and automation in everything from self-driving cars to medical diagnosis, our game's findings show that people are wary of delegating these crucial high-stakes tasks to systems that they perceive as lacking judgment or sufficient intelligence. This applies regardless of malicious intent, but simply a perceived lack of competency. And it highlights a critical challenge in the widespread adoption of AI, which is building user trust, not just in the functionality, but also in the technology's ability to make sound decisions in complex situations.
All right. So we just went through a lot of the very formal takeaways and lessons we've learned. This is some of the more informal lessons we've learned about the process itself. So the main things we learned is reframing leadership, an increased focus on user experience, and changing up the task priority a little bit. So what do those mean, right? Reframing leadership, for me, I was a project manager of this group, and I was working on a very different part of the project compared to everyone else, which gave me a lot of distance from it. Now, what I should have done is I should have leaned into that distance and let myself have some more perspective on making better decisions for the goal of the project. And one of those decisions is the user experience, right? We're collecting data from the users based on what their best decisions are. And we want those best decisions based on what they think, not their lack of understanding of the mechanics or what the game is, or like the difficulty to navigate through the menus or something like that. So putting someone, and the same with the task priority, putting someone directly onto those roles of user experience, I think would have helped us get a lot of better data. And those are some of the next steps we can take into future iterations or other projects similar to this one. All right. Thank you for listening, and make sure you wake up for the next banging SGAI performance or presentations. Thank you so much.
Hi, we're Team Y from the Serious Games with AI course from BWSI. And our team consists of 5 members. Me, Kamal,
Arif, David,
Ethan,
and Evan.
So let's talk a little bit about the project that we've been creating over these past 4 weeks. Our serious game is a colony management simulator that has various features designed to test the player's morality in different situations. So that includes different professions of survivors, colony statistics, resource management, random events that the player must prevent, and a skill tree. And all of it factors into this one research question that we were aiming to answer.
Given the choice, when do people decide to utilize AI in high-stakes situations with a level of uncertainty? And this is the question that our game has been centered around solving. So what have we hypothesized about our question? So Team Y believes that players would use AI near the end of the game so that it would have the least amount of impact, especially like given the game is set in a high-stakes survival situations where one bad choice can lead to the death of all your colonists. But we'll get into that later.
First, let's talk about the game mechanics. The game is divided into two phases, the recruitment phase and the management phase. The initial phase of each round, called the recruitment phase, has a couple different optics for the player to consult in order to make their decisions. So that includes a survivor view, so you can see the survivor, a survivor guide, so you can figure out what profession each one represents, and a radar graph of their stats, so you can identify different weaknesses or strengths that your colony has when making your judgments of which survivors to collect. Additionally, there's an AI takeover button in the bottom right, which we'll get into later.
So after you recruit all of your colonists, then you'll go to this screen, which is the management phase. The management phase lets you control various aspects about your colony, including your survivors and your stats, in order to improve it. So, for example, to begin, we have this stats view page where we have various pieces of information that the player can use. For example, the base resources, the colony daily expenditures, the buffs and debuffs, which are status effects, and the event percentages, which need to be prevented. We also have a skill tree where players can use the stats to unlock certain upgrades for their colony in order to make it a better place. And finally, in order to earn these stats, they will need to put their colonists to work. Here is where you can manage every survivor in your colony. Now, you have a few auto functions in the top left where you can feed all of your survivors and also give them all jobs automatically. However, you can also individually manage them for a greater strategic effect. For example, putting survivors in unusual places like a doctor in a farm in order to generate more food if that is necessary.
So getting back to like the AI takeover button, so we used an RL model that had a 16 element observation vector, which consisted of the humanoid status, so like whether the humanoid was healthy, zombie, injured. We also gave it the current amount of people in the van and the van's total capacity and the remaining time that they had to recruit more people. We also gave it the current colony stats like morale and food storage, and we also gave it the current like skill progression to try to figure out which roles it might want to prioritize. And so our reward structure was positive for saving healthy or injured survivors and increasing your resources. There's big penalties for bringing back zombies, and we also gave a bonus for skill unlocks and maintaining your morale. And then so tempo in the game, we trained it using a PPO on multiple day scenarios, and we randomized the starting colony stats. So that helped the model learn like how to prioritize roles. And in the game, you can run it for one full recruitment stage, and then after you'll get like a pop-up that tells you which like survivors the AI saved and which ones it skipped, so you can review what it did. And it also highlights the AI selected survivors in orange in the management phase.
So what data did we exactly collect? There are a few general and more generalized conclusions that we can reach upon data collection of our test subjects. Some definitive conclusions that we made were, as you could see in the middle green bar graph here, the time spent recruiting and management in management, which was totaled and averaged each day, reasonably decreased in the later days. So you could see the stabilization of the days up until the fourth day, and then the decrease until day 7, the end of the game. This This decline in average time can indicate the learning curve of our game, which had a high complexity and high human action space. And also, because food was a clear limitation presented to the players and we penalized them for the lack of it, they reasonably targeted survivors specializing in agriculture. Even though a balanced distribution would have prevented events to the maximal extent, some players still prioritized some occupations over others to populate their colonies, which is a bias that we'll explain later on. If you see the two graphs at the bottom, uh, yeah, you'll be able to see the agriculture spike and all the other distribution of the occupations. And now for the other conclusions that we reached. Some other quick interesting statistics that we had were a total decision count of 2.2 thousand, an average play time of 33.3 minutes per player, an average hover count of 6.5 over the AI takeover button, which is amounts to a conversion rate of 30.7% from actual presses to hovers. And then the last two bullet points, you could see some of the data that we evaluated and collected based on player input from the survey after the game and their actual actions in the first game. Some other conclusions we could draw, if you look at the bottom contingency tables, is that the game stage affects the AI efficiency and decision count. So later game stage results in higher decision counts and higher efficiency.
So what about our hypothesis? Were we right? Were we wrong? Well, we expected players to use AI late into the game, but we underestimated their distrust of an unfamiliar tool, and AI falls into this category. Many of our players tested the AI early, around days 1 to 3, and if they had a bad impression like many reported, it led to later use. However, when they reported a high trust in the AI, they often use it earlier. But ultimately, most players use the AI around day 6 to allow for 1 day to correct potential mistakes while also being able to reap the benefits. And you can see this from our various graphs.
So, some concluding thoughts that we've been able to come to are that our results show that luckily, players often do not trust AI blindly enough to allow it to directly be responsible for the final product. The vast majority of players would use AI before or on day 6 in order to kind of give themselves a buffer day so that if the AI were to make any mistakes, they would have an extra day to fix them. Our specialization of survivor roles mirrors the perceived values of certain occupations over others on the part of playtesters, as well as the importance of providing an equal playing field for each occupation in order to show its worth. Obviously, agriculture will be prioritized if food is a matter of life or death for your survivors. And an interesting tidbit is that many of our science-minded BWSI students elected to pick scientists as their most valued role out of all of them. And I think our final conclusion that we've come to is don't be jobless in a zombie apocalypse. Thank you, and we'll leave you with this graph.